All right, we're good to go. Thanks for that fantastic introduction. My name is Tim Romero. I've been involved in the Japanese startup scene here for more than 20 years. When I was asked to participate, I eagerly agreed. However, quite honestly, I'm not an interesting enough person to deserve a 10-minute bio. So rather than talk about me, I want to talk about what goes into changing Japan, what underlies the truly transformative technologies that are taking place now, and hopefully by the end of this presentation to dispel one of the biggest myths and misconceptions about how change takes root here. Does that sound good? Woo! My clicker is not clicking.
Oh, there you go.
It's working. But it's a fair enough question. Who the hell am I? And why should you listen to me? So very briefly, I've started 4 companies here in Japan. I've sold 2, I've bankrupted 2, so out of 500, not too bad. I've been involved in countless side projects that got various degrees of traction. I work with a lot of companies that are coming into Japan to help them with sales strategy, partnerships, things like that. And I also run the Disrupting Japan podcast, in which we sit down, we talk with Japanese startup founders about the ecosystem here, about what it's like to build a company here, about their perspective on the economy in general. And it's all in English, so as you might imagine, there's alcohol involved in a lot of these conversations. But what you find is when you speak with the entrepreneurs, when you speak with the people who are actually growing their companies, you get a very, very different perspective and a much more optimistic outlook on the Japanese economy than you do when you speak to the industry associations and the politicians who listen to them. And there's a very good reason for this. But we're getting to the head of our story. We'll get back to that. So first, let's bust a few myths. If you've been in Japan more than, say, 24 hours, someone has told you that Japan changes slowly. This is something that is repeated from politicians at the highest level of government to elementary school students. It's almost a truism that people no longer question. However, it is absolute bullshit. It is categorically wrong. It is an excuse used by people who are either too timid or too misinformed to take steps they know that need to be taken. And if we achieve nothing else by the end of this presentation, I hope we will all agree to never again utter this nonsense. So, with that in mind, onward, or perhaps backward. So, let's take a step back into the middle of the 1800s, where Japan was forced to end centuries worth of isolation when Commodore Perry sailed into Yokohama Harbor with 4 very large, scary American warships that looked absolutely nothing like that. But nonetheless, Japanese leadership realized they needed to change, and thus began what was called the Meiji Restoration, in which Japan changed every single aspect of society: the legal system, the economy, the government, the educational system. A lot of what today is considered the canon of Japanese history was largely put together during this time period. There was not even a unified Japanese language before this time. And yet, a couple of decades later, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. Now, this is not in any way mean to praise militarism. I mean, that path led to untold suffering in Asia and scars that still haven't healed. No, my point is much simpler. Is that from the time period when the Meiji Restoration began in 1868 to the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905, less than 40 years. This is the time it takes most people to say pay off their mortgage. Japan transformed herself from a country that was literally hundreds of years behind the times, technologically, economically, diplomatically, into a nation that defeated one of the world's great powers of the time. This was unprecedented. Nothing like this had ever happened in the history of the world before. But something very much like it would happen again. So Japan's defeat in World War II was total, it was absolute. If you go back and you read what many of the economists that were working with the American occupation forces thought, at the time they were thinking a lot, the general opinion was that Japan would never be able to fully recover. The damage was too severe. And we know how that turned out. Once again, Japan decided it needed to refocus the entire society away from a military-industrial focused society into a consumer-focused democracy. And in less than 40 years, Japan transformed herself from an economic basket case with practically no functioning infrastructure into the second largest economy on the planet. This is not a country that has difficulty changing. No country, now or in the history of the world, has ever been able to change so quickly, so dramatically, and so often as Japan. So, for the love of God, let's all of us stop saying Japan changes slowly. It does not. Japan changes incredibly quickly. But this time, something is genuinely different. Japan's past two economic miracles have both been top-down affairs. They were centrally planned, they were executed through an incredibly efficient and rigid hierarchy. Well, innovation, almost by definition, particularly disruptive innovation, has to be bottom-up. And Japan traditionally has never been very good at bottom-up. But this is starting to change. And this is where the current generation of entrepreneurs differ from the previous generations in one very essential point. So if you look at the great entrepreneurial companies of the 50s and 60s, the Sonys, the Hondas, these companies were aggressive, they were highly disruptive abroad. If you look into Honda's market entry into America, it's an incredible story of pivots and repositioning. But at home, these companies played by the rules. They were not aggressive. They followed administrative guidance. They were very careful not to engage in what the government likes to call excessive competition. And even the great internet companies of recent decades, the Rakutens, Greed, DNA, Mixi, these were not companies that were going head-to-head with NEC and Fujitsu. No. These were companies that were going after a new area that technology had opened up. It was a new market. They were fighting with other startups. But today's entrepreneurs are different. Not all of them are. But I talk to an awful lot of them. And a lot of people will tell you, they'll point to a very large, very powerful Japanese company, and they'll say, in private, mind you, in public, harmony must be maintained. But in private, they'll say, yeah, those guys, they can't really do what we do. Even if they understood it, they couldn't do it. So maybe they'll buy us in 3 years, maybe we'll buy them in 10 years, or maybe they'll be out of business in 20. Makes no difference to me. And that attitude gives me hope. It is that level of competitiveness, it is that level of aggression, the willingness to disrupt, that is what is required to allow social change, to allow change to occur from within Japan rather than from without. And it's already starting to happen. So I have no doubt that in 30 years, Japan is going to be one of the world's, it's going to be a global leader in innovation. And I realize, I'm not naive, how absurd this comment sounds. It sounds every bit as absurd as someone in 1950 saying that Japan would someday be a great economic power, or someone in 1870 saying it would be a great industrial and diplomatic power. But all of those things came to pass. And the reason, which I hope we all understand now, is because Japan changes very quickly. So, if you want to get in touch with me, please do. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm easy to find. Check out the podcast if you want to hear what Japanese founders are saying in their own words. Thanks very much for inviting me here today.